Imagine a world where food never runs out. Water is always available. There are no predators, no dangerous weather, no disease, and almost nothing left to fear. Now imagine that a few years later, not a single mouse is alive. That is what happened inside Universe 25. And the most disturbing part was this. The mice did not die from starvation. They were not wiped out by disease. No predator entered their enclosure. Their world had almost every physical problem solved. So what went wrong? Why did a safe and comfortable society slowly destroy itself? To understand that, we have to go back to the 1960s, when an American scientist named John B. Calhoun was obsessed with a disturbing question. If you remove hunger, thirst, predators, and scarcity from a society, does life automatically become better? Or can a world with almost no physical hardship create a completely different kind of problem? Calhoun had already spent years trying to answer that question. He built experimental environments where rats and mice had plenty of food, enough water, protection from predators, and no real way to escape. Again and again, he noticed strange patterns. The population would grow rapidly, social tension would increase, normal behavior would begin to change. Eventually, reproduction would decline, social relationships would break down, and the colony would begin to collapse. But Calhoun wanted a cleaner experiment. He wanted to remove as many external problems as possible and see what happened when the environment was almost perfect. That experiment became known as Universe 25. In 1968, Calhoun created a carefully controlled enclosure for mice. It contained multiple levels of living space, nesting areas, paths between different sections, constant food, and continuous access to water. The temperature was controlled, the environment was protected. There were no predators waiting outside, there was no shortage of food, there was no shortage of water. Calhoun estimated that the enclosure could support. But he did not begin with thousands. He started with just 8, 4 males and 4 females. Then he closed the enclosure and watched. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The mice explored their new environment, they discovered the different areas, they established places to sleep and built nests. Then the first babies were born, and the population began to grow. For a while, everything looked like a success. The mice were healthy, food was everywhere, water was everywhere. New babies continued to appear. The population expanded quickly. But as the numbers increased, a problem appeared that had nothing to do with food. In nature, when a mouse colony becomes too crowded, some animals can leave. They can move away, find another territory, establish a new area, and create a different social structure. But inside Universe 25, there was nowhere else to go. Every mouse was trapped inside the same social world. And that is when the behavior started changing. Some young males seemed to have no clear role left to play. The dominant positions were already occupied. Territory was limited. Their place in the social hierarchy was unclear. Slowly, some of them began gathering in certain areas of the enclosure. They stopped fighting for territory. They stopped competing normally. They simply remained there, eating, sleeping, and moving around without any obvious purpose. But another group of males went in the opposite direction. They became extremely aggressive. They entered areas occupied by other mice. They interfered with nests. They disrupted normal social behavior. Some of the usual boundaries between individuals began to disappear. The problem was no longer simply fighting. The deeper problem was that the old social roles were beginning to fail. In a functioning mouse colony, behavior follows certain patterns. There are territories, there are dominant animals, there are mothers caring for their young, there are social boundaries, there are predictable ways for individuals to interact. Inside Universe 25, those patterns slowly started breaking apart. Some females moved toward the upper sections of the enclosure and spent more time alone. Their social interactions decreased, their reproductive behavior changed. And as the colony became more crowded and unstable, fewer new babies were successfully raised. Now, the next generation was growing up inside a completely different world. These young mice were not experiencing the same social environment that earlier generations had experienced. They were growing up surrounded by thousands of other animals, but the normal structure of mouse society was becoming weaker. And when these young mice became adults, some behaved in ways Calhoun had rarely seen before. Certain males appeared remarkably uninterested in social competition. They did not fight, they did not seriously compete for mates. They spent large amounts of time eating, sleeping, and grooming themselves. Calhoun eventually referred to some of these animals as the beautiful ones. The name sounds positive, but the reality was disturbing. These mice looked healthy on the outside. Their fur was clean, they were not covered in wounds from fighting. They seemed physically fine. But they were not participating in the future of the colony. They were not reproducing, they were barely engaging with the social world around them. They looked healthy, but something essential had disappeared from their behavior. And that created a problem that could not be fixed simply by adding more food or more water. Because a population can survive for a while, even when its future is already disappearing.
The older mice can remain alive, the food can remain available, the water can remain available. But if enough young animals stop reproducing, the future population is already shrinking.
That is exactly what happened inside Universe 25. At one point, the population reached thousands of mice, but eventually, the growth stopped. Births began to decline. Then they declined even further. Eventually, reproduction nearly disappeared. And remember what was still available: food, water, shelter, protection. There were no predators. There was no famine. There was no outside enemy attacking the colony. The future was disappearing, even though the physical resources were still there. The older mice continued to age, but there were not enough new mice coming behind them to replace the population. The colony did not collapse in one dramatic moment. There was no explosion. There was no sudden epidemic. There was no predator entering the enclosure. The society simply lost its ability to continue its...
One behavior after another weakened. Social roles became less stable. Parenting became less effective. Reproduction declined. Young mice grew up without a normal model of social life. And eventually, the population entered a point where recovery was no longer happening. The last successful conception eventually occurred. After that, no meaningful new generation could replace the aging population.
The remaining mice simply grew older. Some stayed isolated. Some continued grooming themselves. Some continued aggressive behavior. But the colony had lost something much more important than food. It had lost its social future. Eventually, the last mouse died. Universe 25 was over. A world that had almost everything necessary for physical survival had failed to maintain a functioning society. And this is where the story gets much more interesting. Because it would be easy to look at Universe 25 and say, comfort destroys societies. But that is not really the most useful lesson. Calhoun's deeper concern was about something else: meaningful social roles. Think about what a role does for an individual. It gives you a place in a group. It gives you something to contribute. It gives you responsibilities. It gives you a reason to interact with others. It gives you a reason to develop skills and pass something forward. Inside Universe 25, food was available. Water was available. Safety was available. But meaningful roles were not equally available to everyone. Some animals had no territory to defend. Some had no stable social position. Some mothers struggled to maintain functioning nests. Some young mice grew up without seeing a healthy social structure they could become part of. And as those roles disappeared, behavior changed with them. That is why the simple idea that...
The problem was that the social structure needed to give that easy life meaning began to disappear. And there is another important detail. Calhoun was not simply trying to prove that society was doomed. He continued studying these questions because he wanted to understand whether a collapse like this could be prevented. His work eventually moved toward a much more interesting idea. When physical space and traditional roles become limited, a society may need to create new kinds of roles and new ways for individuals to contribute. In other words, if the old reasons for participating in society disappear, people need the ability to create new reasons.
That idea becomes especially interesting when you bring the experiment into the modern world. Because humans are not mice, we can invent new jobs. We can create communities, we can learn new skills, we can build new institutions, we can create art, science, technology, businesses, relationships, and entire cultures that did not exist before. A mouse inside Universe 25 could not decide to redesign its society. A human can. That difference matters. So Universe 25 does not prove that human beings will eventually behave exactly like those mice. It does not prove that comfort automatically destroys civilization. And it certainly does not mean that struggle is necessary for every person to live a meaningful life. What it does give us is a disturbing question. What happens when a society becomes extremely good at solving physical problems, but becomes worse at giving people meaningful reasons to participate? Because food can satisfy hunger, money can buy things, technology can remove effort, entertainment can fill time. But none of those things automatically answers the deeper question: what am I here to do? And maybe that is a part of Universe 25 that still matters. The mice had survival, but their social purpose slowly disappeared. They had resources, but their roles broke down. They had protection, but their social structure weakened.